good morning from TechCentral, and a warm welcome to our Kubernetes webinar brought to you by SUSE. Thanks to everyone for joining us today as we delve into the world of containerization. I'm now going to hand over to Daniel Robus, our host and moderator for today's session.
Thanks very much, Kerry. It was with great anticipation that I got into this Kubernetes discussion because it seems to be all over the corridors wherever we go. People are talking about containerization, and I'm really excited about the three gents that are joining us today. We've got Rob, who's the CTO for Enterprise Cloud Products at SUSE. He's responsible for SUSE's overall strategy and vision for application delivery. He's been working with containers in production environments since before Kubernetes was a thing, and has played a critical role in taking SUSE's application development solutions to market. He's been in apps dev for about 12 years over a variety of companies, so brings a lot of experience to the table. Then we are joined by Simon, who is the EMEA North Director of Sales for Rancher Solutions. Simon's been working in sales and leadership roles in IT for about 20 years, and 13 of those has been in the virtualization environment. You've been at Rancher for about 5 years since the 1.0 release of the product, and in container and Kubernetes space, having worked with the founders of Rancher over 2 companies since 2013. He's seen the container space mature and move from multiple orchestration options to Kubernetes, and has worked with some of the largest and most mission-critical client implementations across EMEA, so brings a wealth of experience to the table. And then lastly, we're joined by Johan, who really gets under the bonnet when it comes to implementation on the open source side. He started his career in telco and has worked for Telkom, which is a brilliant breeding ground for good techies in South Africa, and has been working with SUSE and SA for almost 15 years, growing from being a WAN expert to a full-blown specialist in open source. He is an advocate for SUSE, and as Chief Pre-Sales Resource, Johan works closely with the architectural teams within clients to really scale open source solutions across enterprises. We hear so much about containers and containerization. What did the concept actually mean to you personally, and where do they fit into organizations, Rob?
Yeah, so ultimately, containers really are just a packaging format. They're a really easy way to bundle in everything that an app requires into a portable format.
Okay.
And ultimately, that's all they are at a technical level. But as we move up the chain, they're one of the biggest driving forces behind the explosion in DevOps practices. Containers have really helped enable the DevOps movement to become what it is today. When combined with a world-class container orchestration tool, such as Kubernetes, it enables organizations to enable hybrid cloud in a way that virtualization never really could. Containers and Kubernetes ultimately give developers and platform teams the ultimate abstraction layer. They remove all the complexities of dealing with infrastructure from the individual developer. And for the operator, they remove the need to worry about individual apps. Now, as a result, what that means is that containers sit intrinsically at the heart of cloud-native development, and they really play a key role in helping companies transform digitally. They can support your move to the cloud. They can help you reap the benefits of hybrid cloud as well. But overall, they can help bring new products and features to market quicker, which in the current climate can help companies get the edge over their competition. And I think that's really why market leaders in every industry vertical around the globe are either investigating containers for use at the moment, or they're already actively running production containerized workloads today. Now I'll hand over to Simon to see if you've got any examples or details on that.
I completely echo. For me, there's 3 things behind this, and that it's primarily that it's effectively just that next layer of abstraction. That is the key thing for me, because when you look at particularly the way that they enable that cloud adoption, it's effectively just removed any kind of underlying dependencies. And so hybrid cloud adoption, that complete abstraction from the underlying layer, and also the cloud native app development. There are these effectively sort of these two movements, so to speak, within IT, which, I mean, without containerization, I just don't think DevOps would be where it is today, without a shadow of a doubt, because that abstraction and also that sort of common API base, particularly when you look at it from our perspective, it just gives you complete flexibility, just completely removed from the infrastructure, essentially. So yeah, I kind of echo what Rob was saying, and yeah, I mean, it's certainly what I've seen.
You must have seen a lot of change over the last year with regards to COVID, the pandemic, a new way of working. How are the technologies in the container space helping us adopt the new normal?
I've seen this a fair bit, and let's face it, nobody wants to kind of tie this into COVID, but unfortunately, we've seen massive changes in the marketplace. And I think for me, the most pertinent example is the retail industry. It's not a question of surviving, although obviously that is a very pertinent thing. But I say the retail industry because, I mean, you're not allowed into the high street, certainly not in the UK at the moment, and retailers as such have seen a massive, massive shift where previously there may have been typically is around sort of 80 to 90% of their business is done in the high street and 10 to 20% would be done with their online presence. That's just been a complete flip around. In so much that they're at least sort of 90% plus doing a business within the online platform. And so those that have invested in and been kind of forward thinking to develop effectively cloud native apps, I would say, where they've had this e-commerce presence and they've had an e-commerce platform which has been able to adapt to this kind of change and to handle the scale, they're the ones that have been able to thrive and have been able to adapt to these changes and this shift away from the marketplace. And I think it applies to every industry effectively that has a physical presence, so to speak, but retail, absolutely. Rob, anything to add to that?
You summarized that perfectly. The customers that I speak to on a daily basis, the common theme with that is now they're being asked to do more with less. Now, maybe that's because they've got more people off sick or because their budgets are now more significantly constrained. They have to do more with less, and containers can really help enable that, not just from an application point of view, but from a pure technical perspective of you're making better use of the infrastructure that you've got available. You can fit more apps into the same space and manage them more effectively as well. So as companies really drive to reduce overhead to fit in with the new normal, this is where containers and Kubernetes can really play a key role.
I think you're really highlighting agility on these things, and survival means you have to be able to pivot quite quickly. And you seem to be coming back to that we are not tied in to something almost a lead weight in the architectural side. Romy put a question in the chat, which is, how would you contrast containerization and a serverless framework?
So the way that I personally would contrast them is serverless is just that next level of abstraction on top. Simon was talking about the abstractions that Kubernetes can bring, which is really abstracting the infrastructure. And what serverless is helping us do is abstract the underlying services. So as we move towards making microservices and then making those into even smaller blocks into individual functions, that's where serverless can play a key. And something that we're seeing at SUSE now is a few of our customers who have gone all in on containers and Kubernetes, they're now looking at deploying serverless platforms on top of their containerized infrastructure as well, just to give developers that little bit more agility. The contrast to that is obviously where things are significantly simplified, they're also very opinionated. So you don't have that flexibility to do whatever you want with serverless. You could kind of constrain within the opinions of the individual platform. And for some companies that need a bit more flexibility, they'd rather stick with the containerized model.
Johan, do you want to add to that?
What I've actually noticed when I talk to clients and the implementations that I've done was that if you look at the companies who's actually dealing with the environment of virtualization and so forth, they tend to understand how to install, how to configure certain systems. When you start looking at serverless and Kubernetes, you don't need to basically go and install anything anymore. So it actually changes everything, that you actually can control your platform much easier and control it in such a way that you can slot it in and out like Lego blocks. Now, a lot of companies still have to adapt into that framework. And this is where Rancher actually takes a very big step in understanding how they can basically go from on-prem to cloud product sets to slot certain things in and out as they please.
Okay, that's awesome. We had a question in the QA from Dion, which was, what are the challenges regarding choice of technology, security, strategy, talent, skills, etc.? I've just asked him to clarify a little bit more. But Simon, when customers are embracing a containerization strategy, what sort of person is orchestrating that in order for it not to become a cloud sprawl as opposed to a cloud solution?
The way that you need to address that is to ensure that you have the full orchestration layer in place in order to avoid that kind of sprawl. But I think Dion's question is very pertinent, and it's something that's kind of very dear to my heart, so to speak, in terms of how we engage and how we discuss this with clients, because in terms of what the challenges are, you kind of hit the nail on the head there in that the technology element, that's only one point of it. And to my mind, proving Kubernetes itself as a technology is 10% of the question. The reason that I say that is because the shift into containerization as a technology, it is every bit as much a kind of paradigm shift in the delivery of IT as the change from physical to virtual 20 years ago, when we saw the real adoption of virtualization driven by VMware. And so you have this concept of there's various technologies, but because it is such a massive shift, the challenge is how you actually integrate that into the operation, particularly as an enterprise. It's about the operational adoption. How do we integrate this into our existing operational processes, our operational teams, for instance? Because no matter how you slice it as well, Kubernetes is still a complex beast. Okay. And when you look at that across the full sort of application lifecycle, then there are so many different elements that you need to consider. So you look at not just the Kubernetes technology, but as an operation, you need to look at how you deliver it. What do we do around security? What do we do around storage, networking, monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just this kind of isolated technology.
Okay.
So it's relatively easy, so to speak, to prove that, yes, Kubernetes does what it says on the tin, so to speak, but how you actually integrate that and how you layer that into an operation. I think also he touched on a very good thing. There is no massive surplus, so to speak, of Kubernetes talent in the marketplace as well. And so companies need to ensure that, it's a way of actually, I would sort of kind of flip that around and say that Kubernetes is actually a way of attracting and keeping that dev talent that's out there, because you're effectively using the most modern way of building and delivering applications, which, as one final point, actually, that to me, I think the question came before of how would you relate containerization to serverless architecture. The way that I tend to best describe it is in relation to virtualization. In that, certainly to me, and the experience I've had over the last 20 years, that virtualization was about improving the usage and resiliency of infrastructure. Containerization is about improving the delivery of applications. And that, for me, is the key differentiator.
That's an awesome summary of that. I really like that. Rob, you wanted to dive in there as well.
As Dion says, one of the biggest challenges people face is for choice of technology. In the cloud native ecosystem, there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of different projects and products and solutions that people can go out and review and look at, and identifying what ones are the right one for your business and your platform team can be really challenging. Now, in the market, there's almost two different approaches that vendors will take. As a lot of vendors, they'll build a Kubernetes platform and they'll bundle in various value-added services and almost lock you into those value-added services. They don't give a lot of freedom of choice, whereas other vendors out there do give you that freedom and choice. Now, I personally prefer the approach that SUSE and Rancher have taken, where we provide the base platform plus a select few best-of-breed technologies on top to make that experience more complete and easier. But we don't put any constraints on that. If you want to use one of those thousands of upstream components on the platform, you're more than welcome to. And that's something that's quite different, I think, from our approach than from some of the others out there.
Okay, so one of the questions I wrote down now was, do we go big bang, or can we go division wide, or can we go application wide when we are deploying containerization? And I think because it's coming up more and more and more, it seems to be driving transformation. And is this where your Kubernetes lead comes in, or your containerization, where we have a transformational need in the organization, or is it something that people just take on piecemeal, Simon?
Intrinsically at its heart, this is a strategic technology choice, and it kind of leads into the question of how you cover that, how you're looking at, because it's not something you would do in isolation, so to speak. So yes, we've tended to see in the past that containerization, as with other technologies like virtualization in the early days, you tended to see the kind of skunk works like projects, whereby you'd see an individual. But I take that back to the point that I made previously, that it's something that affects multiple different areas. Now, that's great if you're looking at something at a single application level, that yes, in order perhaps to prove the technology that you can adopt within a single application, but it needs to be with a view to how are we looking to actually utilize this technology over the coming 12, 24, 36, 60 months, because it is such a big shift in what you can deliver and how you can deliver it. Because, for instance, this is Kubernetes, for instance, and container orchestration and Kubernetes cluster delivery is something that's really driving, not just from the data center point of view, but also out at the edge. And this, you're looking at, well, how we can utilize Kubernetes, for instance. If you look at CIO priorities, we can utilize this to drive what we're doing in adopting AI technologies and machine learning technologies, for instance. Anything to add to that?
Johan, I saw you wanted to add in there, you came off mute. Is it affecting how you architect solutions or how you talk about rollout?
What I've noticed was when I start talking to clients, it is really a business case within the organization. Now, the business case comes from the techies up to the CIO, to the CEO level. Now, with Kubernetes, it actually gives them the capability to go to market much quicker than you actually had virtualization and those type of things, because it's cumbersome to basically deploy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where I've actually noticed that if you start looking at the building blocks, when you start looking at the Kubernetes framework, that you can go to market much quicker with your CI/CD processes when you do your continuous integration, continuous delivery of going to market. And then the nice thing about this is you don't have to go and rebuild the whole infrastructure. You can basically slot out the database, slot a new database in the application and so forth. As Rob was saying, you've got a plethora of systems out there or upstream projects that you can choose from if you need to basically go to market in a much quicker way. And that actually ties into the deliverables of what the programmers do within the organizations.
Okay, which leads into a question we had in the Q&A from Christoph, which is, now we've got all these developers who can build stuff and throw it into production. How important are container orchestration tools going to be now? Rob?
It's hard to stress how significant and important these technologies are. At a very kind of futuristic view, container orchestration, and specifically Kubernetes, it is the new operating system of the data center. It's the new operating system of the cloud, and it's going to be the operating system at the edge as well. We're seeing Kubernetes deployments in places we never thought were there. Even in space, for example, there's satellites out there using it right now. In a way, it has almost become the new Linux. Now, the reason why that is it's a great orchestration framework and automation framework. And as Simon said earlier on, the APIs that it gives you for abstracting that infrastructure are so important. And I think there's not going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, a kind of a new fight over which container orchestration tool is going to, become dominant. That is decided already as Kubernetes. And the real excitement begins now in terms of what platforms people build on top of Kubernetes and what new and innovative ways people use Kubernetes to orchestrate their entire organization.
So the foundation is agreed. We're using Kubernetes. We can now move forward. That argument's been had. Have customers lost control already? Are you seeing customers that have just containerized themselves to death and they don't know what's going on? Or are we lucky enough to be early in the game?
So container sprawl definitely is a thing. If organizations go in without a well-defined strategy, without operational buy-in, as Simon said, they can sometimes fall into a pitfall. But conversely, I think overall, that's not something which we're seeing, out there significantly at the moment. I think what's important is for businesses to have the right strategy and to engage with a trusted partner that can help guide them on that journey. If you just kind of start throwing eggs at the wall, you're going to make mess. So, if you do it in a controlled and structured way, you avoid those problems. Simon, do you have an example there?
Simon, you spoke a lot about this mind shift, this paradigm shift that we're in, and Mazwi Shongwe has asked a question, which I'm sure a lot of people are going through. The thinking is like, I've invested so much in virtualization. Is it no longer going to take off? Or does it mean any business environment look at both? Because as far as the infrastructure is concerned, you still want to have the resilience and availability of servers. I think we need to address that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a pertinent question. So essentially, I would say no. Virtualization is still going to be a critical underlying platform for the actual delivery of the infrastructure, but it's and I think that because you still want to effectively get the most that you can, and certainly on in the cloud, it becomes it used to be that do we look at which hypervisor do we look at, and that is no longer, so to speak, such a question. And because we're abstracting away from that underlying layer, it really becomes virtualization is now the de facto delivery method for infrastructure. And certainly when you look at the clouds, generally, the hyperscalers, that's all about delivering a virtual infrastructure with the instances that you can consume. But I would hasten to say that effectively the containerization layer is now so heavily commoditized effectively in terms of, the question of, well, do we take Hyper-V? Do we take a Zen-based hypervisor, KVM? Do we go VMware? That's not really quite so much the question, so to speak, because you are now abstracted away from that layer. But absolutely, I think that virtualization is the de facto infrastructure layer. You'll continue to see developments around some of those technologies, but I would argue that with the onset and the mass adoption that we're seeing of cloud native technologies and containerization, that it just becomes less and less of a question underneath, that it's effectively a tick in the box. What you now need to look at is full integration into the CI and CD delivery of applications.
So these apps that are born in the cloud, the debate isn't there. I mean, we know where we're going. It's more on the modernization on where we are going. And I think a little bit later, we're going to talk about one of your banking clients that we can see a mixture of both, which is pretty cool. I mean, the OEMs, there's a question from Hemu, which is in a PaaS environment where there are multiple OEM presences. What are you seeing in the marketplace with regards to software development or code change management? And Rob, I think that's straight in your wheelhouse. You want to take that?
Yeah, so the more traditional PaaS environments like Heroku or Cloud Foundry, what we're seeing is customers looking to migrate to a more modern solution that gives them a bit more flexibility. And as we talked about earlier on, what most people are doing is building a platform on top of Kubernetes. They're choosing select technologies that allow them to deliver the apps and the frameworks that they need internally to everyone else. Now, this is a longer term shift because PaaS definitely does have a place in this world because it does provide a really quick and easy developer experience. But what we're seeing is a shift to those PaaSes being run on top of Kubernetes, or for the PaaS model to evolve into application PaaSes. And Salesforce is a great example of that, where they've got a PaaS for you to develop within Salesforce's individual environments. And I think what we're starting to see is companies bringing those in-house. So they're building, these custom PaaSes in-house, and the developers may never even touch Kubernetes. They don't have to learn what it means because the CI/CD, GitOps frameworks are in place. The developer just has to write code, push it out, and the platform takes care of the rest.
We slide pizza under the door, they slide code back. That kind of idea. Simon, you wanted to add there?
Yeah, it's just a nice kind of segue into the way that I like to position the Rancher technology, because the way that I view it is, I've always kind of described the Rancher technology as the anti-PaaS, because we effectively we deliver a huge amount effectively of that PaaS-like technology, but the key point being that we don't provide any of the lock-in. that you see within. That's absolutely at the heart of what we do. And for my mind, and I know I get opinionated about these things, but in containerization and Kubernetes space, if you adopt a locked-in platform, particularly as your sole means of delivery, you are missing 95% of the entire point of containerization. And that it really sits at the heart of it. This is an open source driven technology and community.
And that's why it's a paradigm shift. I mean, it's almost, you used it, I'm going to bring it in. It's a different religion when it comes to your development framework. We need to immerse ourselves. Where do people go to get a kickstart into this? Johan, where do South Africans go to find out more and almost start at the base layer to make sure they haven't missed the foundations of what is containerization, what is Kubernetes, what is management behind it?
Okay, so what I've noticed is that when people start talking about it, they reach out to the likes of us, because when you start looking at the open source components, it's quite difficult to basically build and deploy a Kubernetes framework. And sometimes they need to basically get some help around that. And they reached out to us because within Rancher, it's so much easier to basically take this whole component and deploy it. For example, it will take maybe an hour and a half to actually deploy the whole Rancher component with RKE, that you've got your nodes already positioned. And then we show them that, and it's basically just go for it.
And just to add to that, because that's such a pertinent point, Johan, and I think, I mentioned about this being an open source driven community, so to speak, and the point that Johan's making as well is what we do is 100% open source. And so how can we get started in this? Well, you can get started in this with absolutely zero cost, certainly from a licensing perspective. Go to GitHub, download Rancher, and an hour and a half later, as Johan says, you have a platform effectively.
And in addition to that, on rancher.com, there's also the Rancher Academy. There's a whole world of free training and resource out there that can take, someone from zero to pretty proficient, and it's free. So in addition to that, YouTube videos.
Is there a stairway? Is there kind of a stairway that can reach us into Kubernetes heaven? Yeah. So if we've got any developers here who are advising their organizations, there is a logical way progression for them?
Well, I would say yes, because the progression is basically to understand the Kubernetes environment. Then that's going to be from the admin point of view, taking the whole component of saying, okay, now we deploy the platform. Now, basically, the developers will need to basically look at how they're going to integrate the CI/CD components into the platform. But now also a very key component is to understand how security works, because you can't just go and pull anything from the internet. You need to make sure that you've got your own registry. You need to make sure that you can actually put your code into your own trusted
And that's
resource.
Explained pretty clearly. Okay, cool.
Yes, and that's the steps, what you need to basically go into the whole Rancher component, understanding those paradigms.
Okay. David asked a question, which is, does Kubernetes signal the end of Ansible?
No. Simple.
No.
Yes.
So simple answer, David, no.
Certainly from my point of view, there are extensions, when you look at this as a full sort of CI/CD delivery pipeline, effectively, the point is that there are additional tools that you will want to be using. Now, if you want to look at it, certainly from our perspective, we don't care if you want to use Ansible, we don't care if you want to use TeamCity or Bamboo or, Jenkins, all of these various technologies that can add around it. And I think the way that we look at it, when you look at Kubernetes management, the Kubernetes management and orchestration layer will take care of three things. You have your underlying, or the way that we view a Kubernetes management platform, you have your underlying Kubernetes technology. So you need your CNCF certified, and that's the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, certified Kubernetes distributions. You then, on top of that, require a set of operational tools, so your authentication integration. And I think there's a whole wealth to talk about on the, Johan made a really good point there in terms of how you actually, the step to adopt it. I think we could run an entire session just purely on that. But you have these operational tool sets, which are focused at how do we integrate this for our operators who typically, as I've seen, may not be as Kubernetes savvy, so to speak, as the developers, the developers and the DevOps focused people. And then your third bucket of services is the integration into those DevOps focused technologies, which you'll always require kind of on top of that. So things like your service mesh, your CI/CD, all of these various components and logging and, items like that, for instance. Rob, anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, Ansible at its core, it's configuration management. It's there to configure the underlying infrastructure rather than orchestrate it in the same way that Kubernetes does. But what we're now starting to see through projects like Cluster API and even through the Kubernetes Ansible operator is Kubernetes is starting to drive a bit further down the stack. So now we can provision certain types of infrastructure with Kubernetes directly. And I think over time that will grow. And it's going to take a little while to get there, but one day potentially you'll be able to use Kubernetes to do the vast majority of what Ansible does today from a configuration management standpoint.
Just a random question off the cuff, Rob. What sort of organization best embraces containerization in Kubernetes? Is it an agile focused? Is it a waterfall focused? Where is, I know this is going to work?
Any organization that really wants to be a leader in their space. So this isn't just something we're seeing in tech organizations or in agile organizations. Some of the oldest brick and mortar companies in the country, we're seeing want to modernize and embrace this technology. But as Simon said earlier, it's not just a case of, I've installed Kubernetes, great, we're cloud native. There's a whole organizational change that has to happen. And what we do see is some companies use this technology to spark that fire and start them down that journey, because you'd be surprised how simply the development team moving to a container cloud native model can impact the day-to-day life of someone in HR, for example, who doesn't necessarily know about this technology, but because they're part of that organization and the whole organization has to modernize with the technology.
The reason that it's non-industry specific, so to speak, is this is also, let's take it down to brass tacks. It's about competitive advantage as well within any industry. Although I've seen sort of multiple industries adopting this, there is no one single benefit. When you look at it and you look at it, let's say from an insurance company or a banking or finance company perspective, is that ability to deliver applications quicker. What does that mean for your business? What does it mean to be able to deliver a new product to market 2 weeks ahead of your competitors? And there's also, quite frankly, the question of driving down cost. I mean, cash is absolutely king in these days of reduced revenues and the having to adapt to new market conditions. And so having a potentially lower cost platform and lower operating costs and ability to deliver quicker, I don't care if you're a media company or a finance company or a government organization, that is a perennial issue, or rather a perennial advantage that is going to resonate regardless of industry.
Guys, you've been throwing around a lot of terms when you're talking around these companies and where they're going. And that's come out, I'm confused about, is Kubernetes distribution versus Kubernetes management. What's the difference, Simon?
A very kind of simple way to compare it would be to look at different Linux distributions, for instance. So the difference between Kubernetes distributions. So what you have is, like sort of a Linux kernel, you have at its core, you have the Kubernetes CNCF based core, effectively. You have this core of technology, and then different companies will effectively provide sort of a separate extension, so to speak, so to that technology, to allow them to deliver their own particular flavor, their own particular extensions and services. So the actual Kubernetes distribution, you can look on that as just sort of slight shades of gray against the core of Kubernetes. And typically speaking, they're not wildly diverse, but in the same way that you'll have Ubuntu and SLAES and Red Hat against, although they're slightly different in that it's a bit more, there's a bit more on top of that. You have these multiple distributions. So as a couple of examples, you have things like Amazon's EKS, you have Rancher's RKE, so there are, which are effectively just, they're all based on upstream Kubernetes, but they just have these slight differences to deliver the additional services on top that we have. Kubernetes management is about how you manage those holistically rather than sort of delivering them in isolation, so to speak. So the management point, so you have your underlying Kubernetes distribution, which is your choice, so to speak, of how you deliver that Kubernetes. So it may be, as I say, via EKS, it may be via RKE, we've always taken the approach of we're actually unique in the marketplace in that not only do we provide you a non-prescriptive tool set to deliver the value add services above, in that we allow you to deploy any version of Kubernetes. The Kubernetes management, so you have those 3 layers that I talked about. Your Kubernetes distribution is the first layer. Those operational tools and the sort of DevOps focused integration tools, that's the Kubernetes management that you have over that.
I've noticed when you start installing a Rancher, you can import different Kubernetes platforms into the Rancher dashboard.
Okay,
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. We've got another question there from Christoph. Any thoughts on managing on-prem container-based to cloud container-based workload management? Any thoughts on the differences and where do we fit in?
The primary difference is the infrastructure. So when we're talking on-prem container management, we don't have already the elastic load balancers, for example, that we're used to in the cloud. We don't necessarily have dynamic storage available. We have to, on-prem at least, provision those in advance. But once we've done that, managing them is largely the same. Obviously, on-prem, we can't scale as rapidly as we could in the cloud. And also when, if you're deploying directly into the public cloud, there's a lot of cloud provider specific features that you could perhaps use. For example, AWS EKS integrates quite well with the AWS networking architecture. But the potential problem with that is you might not then be able to migrate your workloads to another cloud or back on-prem without doing some changes, because the cloud providers are always trying to lock you in with those specific features. And that's why really, what Simon was saying earlier with Rancher, having a holistic management across the board is really valuable, because then you don't need to worry about managing your cloud container infrastructure. Rancher's taking care of that for you. You worry about Rancher, you interact with Rancher, and it abstracts away the differences between managing containers on-prem and managing them in the cloud. It comes with software load balancer. It can easily deploy software-defined storage, and it can take a lot of that pain away from on-prem container management.
There's also the question of governance. When you look at it as an enterprise, particularly in regulated industries like banking and insurance and, government and such like that, I go back to that point of containerization is that you've got a completely portable platform. Kubernetes at its heart, if I sum it up in one sentence, it's build code once, deploy it anywhere. And so having something which enables you to have, as I say, a strategic technology choice, you may very well want to consume certain applications in the cloud today, but in 12 months time, who's to say that, you won't want to utilize another cloud? And so therefore, what you want is a central platform where you can deliver this common set of services and allow you to deploy to any of those underlying architectures. And, regulation may require you to still run some applications on-prem, and then you can take advantage where possible of cloud-based services.
We spoke earlier, Simon, you were mentioning that cash is king, especially in the pandemic, especially where we are now. We've got to look after our cash, and potentially cloud solutions are better. It's better to subscribe than to buy. And there's a lot of pressure to migrate applications to cloud, development to cloud. Is SUSE in a position to help customers get there? Is there any technology that can help to get rapid realization of cloud?
No, absolutely. We've got software-defined infrastructure and hybrid cloud offerings, but really it's been the Rancher acquisition that I think is, most relevant to what you're saying. And it is with SUSE Rancher that we're going to support our customers and our future customers in their journey to cloud. And I think I'm just going to hand over to Simon to really talk through those key benefits. And I think, now might also be a good idea to share the ABSA case study as well.
When you talk about cash as king, particularly in terms of what we've demonstrated with this case study via ABSA, the way that SUSE Rancher kind of has approached licensing, okay, this is absolutely a key thing to me, and it's the heart of what we do, and why, to my mind, you should be adopting a platform like Rancher rather than something that's traditionally lock-in based like OpenShift or some similar comparative technologies. The way that we license is that it removes licensing as an architectural consideration. certainly on the Kubernetes deployment layer. And that is the key thing for me, because what we do is we don't take an approach of per core. What we say is that, and this is obviously, this is purely for how we actually define how we deliver support, because there is no distinction between Rancher open source and Rancher enterprise. All you do is you pay us a full support contract. We don't make any distinction on what the resource is within the nodes that we license. So, whereas you'd have something which traditionally would be licensed on a per core basis, which I think, quite frankly, is a dying legacy licensing scheme, which, harkens a bit back to, 10, 20 years ago. We just say you license per node, and we don't care where those nodes are. A node is a node is a node. It can be on-prem, it can be cloud-based, it can be a VM, it can be a physical server, but more to the point, it can be a single dual core CPU, or it can be 64 octo core CPUs. We don't care. And so what that allows you to do is to take advantage of the best infrastructure and the best resource profile for the specific application. So if you can take advantage of bigger boxes, take advantage of them. What it also allows us to do, the fact that we're this kind of 100% open source and abstracted layer, is that we are a true trusted advisor, to my mind, because what we have is no ulterior motive to sell you any other set of management tools. I mean, yes, there are a set of additional set of management tools, but all we want to do is to advise you around how to get the best solution for your particular deployment and use case. So ABSA were, I think, again, when you look at this, it's both what they've done today and how they're very forward thinking in terms of the adoption of Kubernetes and the potential strategic implications of Kubernetes, which is what Rancher is absolutely at the forefront in delivering, with tools like K3S and such like, which allow for the deployment of multi-cluster Kubernetes applications at the edge. So ABSA had been running an OpenShift environment, and this, I'm seeing this more and more, and very much so in South Africa, and particularly in finance industry. They've been running OpenShift for just over 3 years. And when they started, it was a single application running 40 containers for a particular division. Fast forward 3 years, they're running close to 3,500 Kubernetes pods, running applications which touched on every single division. At the time, because they're now sort of taking a more multi-cluster approach, but at the time it was that you had this approach of having a single mega cluster, which was carved up into micro clusters, which became a nightmare to manage. At an enterprise scale, when you look at the way that has evolved, when you look at a single application up to 3,500 pods effectively, and this was set to grow to around 6,000 pods. One of the key things, I will bring it back to cost, because we talked about this element of cash is king. We're about to release into the public domain the case study. We're looking at over 75% savings by adopting Rancher versus kind of the OpenShift licensing. But what they have is a much more flexible platform. They have the ability, and they've actually taken this and they've developed some incredibly pertinent and useful solutions, particularly in the South African industry. So, for instance, what they've done is they've created a Kubernetes-based low GSLB solution called on K8GB.io, where it just helps with the pan-African issues around global load balancing. And they've also produced a tool called Subatomic, which is on GitHub, and you can go there. That helps to automate the process of bringing the developers on board in a much more sort of automated fashion and with minimal disruption to the actual developers themselves. So, essentially what they've done is they've taken this 3-year-old platform. They've very quickly, and I would suggest easily, because it's about engagement with us as well, how we engage with them to ease the adoption. So by, taking all of these resources that we've got, which I'll touch on just when we wrap up, to help to get the buy-in at every level of the organization. Don't assume adoption. They didn't assume adoption by, by the developers. They engaged us, they engaged their container teams to deliver, training courses and knowledge transfer sessions. The final results, they're now a year down the line with Rancher. They've migrated over, I think they're on over 5,000 Kubernetes pods running Rancher. They're saving massive amounts of money versus the OpenShift licensing. They've got a more flexible platform. And to touch on the future strategy stuff, what they're looking at doing is utilizing K3S to run in 7,000 branches across 11 countries in Africa. and it's a
Jeez.
phenomenal story.
Simon, we don't have enough time to do it justice. Is there somewhere we can read about it?
I believe we're just publishing today, I think, or we published yesterday. So absolutely. And anybody can contact us following this, and, we can send out details and have a chat with anybody.
Awesome. That would be brilliant. We've got one more 2-second question, which I'm sure you can answer. Hemu has asked, is the lowest and or highest node level for licensing? And then I'd like you to wrap, what do we do for the next quarter? And then handing over to Rob and Johan.
Starting point, 2 management servers and 20 nodes. 2 management servers just purely to split your prod and non-prod systems. That's best practice. As for maximum, well, Rancher will scale to run 1 million Kubernetes clusters now with version 2.5. And in terms of the maximum amount of nodes, we have clients running thousands upon thousands of nodes, and scalability of management is not an issue. And sorry, just very quickly to clarify that's for the commercial support level. You can go and get started with 1 node today, by the way, just to clarify that for Hemu. If you want to just go to GitHub, download Rancher and get started with a single node if you like.
Rob, what would you say for our attendees? What are the next steps?
Yeah, so for yourselves that are joining, well, first of all, thanks for joining today. And you're going to be sent some follow-on emails from SUSE and from our marketing team. Have a read through them. They're going to contain the links to the case studies that Simon's mentioned and some links to how your teams can get started with Kubernetes and with SUSE Rancher Kubernetes as well. We can also arrange a call with yourselves to discuss what your needs are and see how we can, work together to enable some of the cool things that we've talked about today. We can have one-to-one discussions. We can do demos for you. We can help proof of concepts and, general training as well. And I'll hand over to Simon for what the next steps for your team members should be.
Yeah, so socializing this stuff is very important within the organization. As I say, it's important to get people involved and to start to socialize the technology. So we produce a massive amount of content for our open source and commercial community effectively. So first and foremost, so we do weekly free online Kubernetes and Rancher training where all of this is recorded. It's posted to YouTube. You can go to the YouTube Rancher Labs channel. As the next step to follow on from that, we then have masterclasses where we go into sort of more in depth on specific subjects like running on, life cycle on EKS, networking, storage, etc. We actually also then do hands-on free online training, Rancher rodeos, we call them, that I'm particularly proud of those because they were mine and Chris Irwin, our head of field engineering technology. They were our baby. But basically, I think the next English language one, so I'll be delivering that one as well. That's on, I think it's February the 18th, but if you go to rancher.com/events, and then you can go and you can just subscribe. They are absolutely free. They are hands-on training where you'll get to go onto our training platform and run through scenarios, deploy highly available applications running in Rancher. So yeah, there's just a huge amount of content around training and it's all free and it can help you to start to get the grasp of the basics of Kubernetes and Rancher, and then to go into the master classes and to go into these hands-on free lab trainings and really get to grips with Kubernetes.
Thank you so much. Johan, anything from your side in a parting shot across the bow?
For all the attendees, thank you for joining. And if you guys need to reach out to myself or the local team, I'm more than happy to basically go and do a deep dive around how to basically install and configure Kubernetes into one cluster node or multiple cluster nodes. Reach out to us and we'll glad to help you.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much. Guys, I'd like to thank you for a very informative session. I think my knowledge has just gone through the roof from a perspective of why Kubernetes is so important, containerization, and specifically the management thereof. I think in summary, 2 things that I've taken out is that this is not an all or nothing for an organization, but it is a change journey that they're going to be going on. So you can put your toe in the water for a very little investment, but the returns are going to be quite quick and going to be felt across the organization. And the second thing is that in these changing times where we're all working from multiple locations, our adoption and adaptation to how we deploy applications needs to be thought about, and we need community for that. And if SUSE's anything to go by, Rancher and SUSE together create an environment where there are no stupid questions, there are just questions, and there are people around that can help us get a head start a lot quicker. So I'm really excited to see how this partnership grows from strength to strength and how organizations embrace containerization in their application deployment. Kerry, thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I'm going to hand over to yourself and the TechCentral team.
So just to thank you guys for attending today. I really hope that you found today's session insightful and enlightening. We always appreciate your input in our sessions, so please do pop us a mail, send us a tweet or an email. Let us know what you thought of the session today and what you'd like to see in future webinars. We will be doing a webinar report back, which we'll publish on TechCentral together with a live webinar as well. So do take a look at the article when it's published and share with your internal teams. I will let you know as soon as this is live. So cheers from TechCentral, and we'll see you at the next one. Have an awesome day further, guys.